If you pick your villains because they're convenient, then you don't learn anything from history. And there's a lot of villains in the story leading up to World War II. There's lots of reasons we don't enter the war until December 1941 when we're attacked. You don't learn anything from history just finding a scapegoat and blaming everything on him.
Some experts chase attention, but the smart ones build authority. You're listening to the Authority on Demand podcast, where credibility becomes your competitive advantage. Every week, we're pulling back the curtain on how founders and leaders turn expertise into inbound demand through books that position, media that converse, and strategies that actually move the needle. I'm Danielle Hutchinson, your host and Chief Creative Officer at Authority on Demand. Now, let's turn your authority into leverage. So in 2 years, the world will mark the 100th anniversary of one of the most iconic moments in American history, Charles Lindbergh's solo transatlantic flight. And when that moment comes, my guest today intends to be standing at the center of it, telling a story nobody else can tell. Welcome to Authority on Demand. I'm your host, Danielle Hutchinson. This show exists because credibility without visibility is just a well-kept secret, and the world loses when the wrong voices dominate the conversation. So today I am joined by Dr. Jonathan D. Reich, a cardiologist and aerospace engineer on faculty at Stanford and Johns Hopkins, and the author of A Convenient Villain. What started as a pandemic read turned into years of archival research, a published book that is rewriting the historical record, and a mission to make sure one of America's most misunderstood figures finally gets a complete reckoning. So let's get into it. John, welcome to the podcast. It's an honor to have you on.
Thank you for having me.
Hey, real quick before we jump back in, if you're loving what we're doing here, hit that subscribe button and drop us a like. We're bringing you the best authors, the most real conversations, and all the writing wisdom that you didn't know you needed. So stick around because it only gets better from here. All right, now let's get back to the conversation. Yeah, of course, of course. I think what you're doing here is very important work. And as we heard from my little introduction there, we're in for a treat getting to learn about American history and, what's to become of our future based on that. But before we talk about that, though, let's chat about you a little bit. I mean, you have a very impressive backstory, aerospace engineer and cardiologist, not to mention, everything else you've accomplished. So walk us through how these different worlds have shaped who you are today. How do you think it's influenced who you are now?
So I graduated from Columbia University and got a job with the Navy as an aerospace engineer. And I spent a couple of years in the Navy designing airplanes that would eventually see combat in the first Gulf War. So around 1988, 89, the Cold War came to an end. There were no more jobs for aerospace engineers. I went to medical school. Became a cardiologist, practiced for 17 years. My other qualification, as if I needed more, is that I'm Jewish. Charles Lindbergh is often considered the iconic anti-Semite of the 20th century. And during the pandemic, I read a book about Lindbergh and expected to maybe cut him some slack because of what happened to his son being kidnapped and murdered. But what I found was that the story wasn't being told correctly, that the 3 trips that he made to Nazi Germany between 1935 and 1938 were espionage trips. They were intelligence trips. And the more research I did, the more I was amazed to find that this has all been in the public record since the 1950s. And as an aerospace engineer, I felt that I had an ability to follow the story of what he saw in Nazi Germany and how it helped us win the war. He also invented the first cardiac perfusion pump, which as a cardiologist I found absolutely fascinating, that a man with an 11th grade education could make such a large contribution to American medicine. So podcast asked me what I'm going to write next. I'm not going to write anything else. I don't think I'll ever find a story that I was intended to write, that I was so clearly intended to write. I don't know that there's any other Jewish aerospace engineers that want to spend 3 years writing a book.
Understood. Well, hey, I mean, I think this is beautiful to say that, like, this was a story that was meant for you to tell. I mean, you yourself just seem to have so much in common with him, being that you both are in the same fields. I mean, maybe you're not necessarily a spy yourself. I mean, maybe you are, and we just don't know it. I mean, if you are, so your secret's safe with us. But, I mean, I think that's wonderful how some people go years searching for the right story for them, wondering
what can I write about? Like, I want a book out. What's it going to be? What's it going to be? Yours just, seemed to grow out of your passion for it. And I guess kind of just to backtrack, was there a certain moment when you discovered him, you realized I have to tell this
Well,
story, or did it kind
my
of
mother, my mother was an historian,
grow?
and she was wrote her thesis on Harry Truman. So I grew up learning, like when everybody else got to go to Disney World, we went to Warm Springs, Georgia to see Franklin Roosevelt's house. So I heard a lot about Lindbergh growing up. I heard a lot about that he was an anti-Semite growing up.
Mm.
Um, when I read this book and I realized how complicated the story was, I tried to write a magazine article, but realized you can't get this down to 1,500 words. There's too much material. People are looking for their story their book that they want to write. I don't know that other people really want to write a history book. It's hard to write a history book. It takes a lot of work. And I went to Yale to go through his papers, and I went to Minnesota to visit his boyhood home, and I went to St. Louis to see the Missouri Historical Society. And as a physician, I can do that. I have the ability to do these things. And as I have a wife who's understanding and is understanding me taking going on all these trips to see all this stuff, but it's a hard thing to do to write a history book. And historians are like any other profession. They're very protective of their turf, and they don't give a lot of respect to non-historians who write history books. But I've been publishing medical journal articles for 30 years. I know how to write research papers. I know how to document. I know how to write. And I don't see why I can't write a history book if I do the work, if I do the research.
Right, exactly. But there's a lot of work to be put into it too. So it's almost like a threshold, right? Like, and you could write the book, there's no reason not to, but also you need to have that dedication behind it, the passion to ensure that it's done
Yes.
correctly and justly. I mean, you yourself were able to kind of fit both sides of his story in there. You don't ignore the controversial pre-war politics. I noticed you acknowledge his real problems on his record while also arguing his legacy at the same time. So that in itself is a feat, not only in the research, but also in the presentation. So
I'm not
talk about that.
I'm not out to defend him. I have no
Mhm.
attachment to him. He wasn't related to me. I'm out just to tell the story fairly. I think everybody's entitled to that. If you want to hate him, you're welcome to hate him.
Right.
If you believe he's an anti-Semite, it's a belief. I can't argue with you. All I can do is say this is what he did that was good, and this is what he did that was bad, and not ignore the bad part. And I think that's what historians have done. I mean, not ignore the good part, not just emphasize the bad part and ignore the good part, but put both sides out there with the amount of weight that they need in terms of what effect they had on the world, and then let the reader decide what the reader thinks his legacy should be. I get emails from people all the time. I read your book. I still think he was a bastard. Okay, fine, fine. He was not a terribly nice man. And he did a lot of things in his life that weren't terribly nice. But I just read a 900-page book by one of my Stanford colleagues named David Kennedy on World War II. And even in 900 pages, you can't talk about everything. So he mentions a certain airplane called the P-51, which was the premier US fighter plane. And he says it appeared in 1944 and it helped give us air superiority, and that's true. He doesn't go into where did the engines come from, who developed the engines, where did the technology come from, what did Lindbergh steal from the Germans that he gave to American engine manufacturers. He doesn't, and I understand that. You can't go into everything in 900 pages. But there are historians who've written very good books about engineering. David McCullough wrote a book about the Brooklyn Bridge called The Great Bridge, which is half of it is engineering and medicine, and the entire civil engineering department at the State University of New York in downstate in Brooklyn helped him write the book. Historians can write about engineering. They can present both sides of the story if they want to. I just don't think people ever wanted to.
Right. Yeah. And well, I think, would you argue that we have a duty to present both sides of the story? I mean, being that history is always, the quote is written by the winners or whoever's saying it, right? Do you think it's a duty as a writer, historian, or
Yes,
authority member?
the problem is that each generation has a different take on the world.
Mhm.
And his generation, my grandparents' generation, lived through World War II. They lived through the Holocaust. They could not be unbiased. They could not divorce their hatred of his pre-World War II advocacy from any contributions he might have made. I understand that. but we're 80 years, let's 80 years, it's been 80 years since we entered World War II. And I think we can look at objectively. Certainly as a Jew who came of age after the Six-Day War, I don't have the same fears and insecurities that my grandparents did. I've never been afraid to tell people who I am or to advocate for myself, but my grandparents' generation was. The First Amendment guarantees every American the right to advocate for themselves. And I'm just as much as an American as anybody else, and I've never felt any other way. So I can read Lindbergh's advocacy and not be threatened by it because it's so far in the past it doesn't threaten me anymore, which allows me to write a different version of his history than the historians who have already written about him.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting to think about because I can imagine as time goes on and different world events happen, it really does shape, what the general public thinks of certain things. I mean, I think of today's day and age and the things going on in our own politics and how that shapes our perceptions of it. And I can only imagine that the same goes for then. So,
And there's an awful lot of hindsight, right? In
yeah.
every war that this country's had, there are people who say we shouldn't enter the war, right? So if you're talking about Vietnam, Robert F. Kennedy Sr. is a big hero because he opposed Vietnam. If you're talking about World War I, there was a man named Bob La Follette, who's a senator from Wisconsin, who opposed entering World War I, and he was right. So if it turns out to be a bad war, then you're a hero. But if it turns out to be a good war, like World War II, then you're a villain. But that's hindsight. Nobody knew how World War II was going to turn out. They didn't even know there was going to be a Holocaust before we entered the war. So to Lindbergh is a villain because he was wrong. But not being able to predict the future doesn't make you evil. It may make you wrong, but it doesn't make you evil. And that is something our generation can look at that my parents and my grandparents' generation couldn't.
Understood. Right. And I guess that's kind of where the title of the book might tie in, The Convenient Villain.
Uh-huh.
Don't you feel
Yeah,
like
there it is behind me over there. Yes, that's the title of the book, A Convenient Villain. And the reason it's called The Convenient Villain is that it's very easy to blame Lindbergh because he was wrong, because he opposed a good war. He never ran for political office. He never defended himself. He never spoke to the press. He didn't have any legislative accomplishments. His accomplishments were in espionage, which is very difficult to demonstrate and to prove. But if you pick your villains because they're convenient, then you don't learn anything from history. And there's a lot of villains in the story leading up to World War II. There's lots of reasons we don't enter the war until December 1941 when we're attacked. And the message is that you don't learn anything from history just finding a scapegoat and blaming everything on him. Whether he was a good guy, whether he was a bad guy, whether he was right or wrong, you can't learn any lessons just by blaming everything on him.
Understood. Right. So the lessons that we can learn is well, if you can't learn lessons by blaming it on him, I guess lessons are learned by demonstrating the truth. I'm just trying to think of the converse.
So what happened was during up till 1920, we had unlimited immigration to this country. The Republicans win the 1920 presidential election, and we start restricting immigration. So you have all these Jewish people trying to get out of Europe, and the United States is taking as few as they can. As little as the visa numbers were, more than half of them were wasted because the State Department decided that they didn't want Jews in the country, and they deliberately restricted immigration from Jews and only Jews. Non-Jews got as many visas as they wanted. So in all of Europe, about 1.5 million visas went unused. That's 1 out of every 4 Jews who was killed in the Holocaust. Went unused because the State Department decided they didn't have to issue them to Jews. Now, what you have to remember about the 1930s is that we had a Dust Bowl. And during the Dust Bowl, we had 3 million people that were displaced and got no medical care. And there were tens of thousands of Jewish physicians in Germany who could have come to the United States and helped these people and taken care of these people. With the Jewish dentists, Jewish scientists, Jewish pharmacists. I mean, of the Jewish physicists that left Germany alone, 100 Jewish physicists left Germany between 1930 and 1939. They won 11 Nobel Prizes. The human potential that was lost because the State Department decided that they didn't need to issue visas to Jews is unimaginable. Hundreds of thousands of American children either died or suffered from diseases that were treatable. Pellagra is a deficiency of a B vitamin. They could have been given food that had B vitamins in it. Scurvy, you need vitamin C. Asthma, I mean, it was a dust bowl. There was dust all over the place. These kids were having terrible asthma attacks. We had medicine. We had theophylline. We had medicines that could treat asthma in the 1930s. There were no doctors. Where were the doctors? They were stuck in Europe. That's the villain. There's your villain right there. That's the point I'd like to make. And this isn't just me saying this. If you go to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., you can see the exhibits on it. They have exhibits on all the visas that went unused during World War II. It's not something that I invented, or you have to go look at some fringe history book to find. Just go to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., and you'll see it right there.
Fascinating. Yeah. And I think like what you're doing here then is only just building it up and supporting that so others can realize that truth at the end of the day. I completely understand. So, yeah, I mean, kind of branching off of that then, I guess who would you say you wrote the book for? Would it be more so like the general public, or is there a specific type of audience that you think could benefit?
That was a question that I wanted to get to. I didn't write it for historians. I didn't write it to compete with the history books. I think it does compete. I think it's just as well researched as any history book you buy. I wrote it for young people who have not been affected by the previous history. I wrote it for Jewish people who continue to idolize Franklin Roosevelt, who was in charge of the State Department. He was the one who picked these people for the State Department. It was his administration. It was his policies that they were enforcing. No, I think Franklin Roosevelt was a great president. He won the war. I mean, as a Jewish person, there was nothing more beneficial to us than winning the war. But he did not always prioritize our interests, and we did not hold his feet to the fire. And we really have to learn from that. And I think every minority group, every ethnic group that has an issue has to learn what happens if you don't advocate for yourselves effectively and you let other people advocate for you. Because the conflict between Lindbergh and the Jews was Lindbergh saying the Jews want to enter World War II. And that's true, we did. It was our right. We were American citizens and we had every right to advocate that. But the reason we wanted to enter World War II is because our families couldn't get out of Europe. And the reason our families couldn't get out of Europe was because the Roosevelt administration wasn't letting them. Now, Lindbergh recruited a lot of scientific talent in his life. He recruited engineers for the United States and scientists for the United States. If we had spoken for ourselves, then we would have agreed with each other. He never advocated. A lot of isolationists, a lot of people opposed to World War II, advocated restricting immigration. Lindbergh did not. He never advocated that. If we had been speaking for ourselves, we wouldn't have had a conflict with him. There was no way for him to know what we wanted because we weren't speaking for ourselves. That's the lesson I want people to learn.
Understood, right. So pretty much like being able to speak for ourselves and be aware of what's going on too, not just like assuming one thing is something, but actually like maybe doing our own research and due diligence too.
And holding the feet to the fire of the people that you voted for. They work for us. So we have that right. One of the themes of the 1930s that Eleanor Roosevelt, who I also think was great, I'm not criticizing Eleanor Roosevelt, but she gave several interviews where she said that the Jews needed to blend into American society. We needed to be more American, which is a way of saying that although we have a First Amendment right to advocate for ourselves, we shouldn't. And that's the wrong message. She, later on realized she was mistaken, said it was the greatest regret of her life. But people shouldn't think that they're not Americans or want to be Americans so badly that they're willing to sacrifice their rights to advocate and to the Constitution says petition our government to address our grievances. And we all have that right, and we should never hesitate to do it for fear that we'll be called names, un-American, dual loyalty, whatever it is. We need to advocate for our interests.
Understood. Yeah, exactly. So just kind of standing up for that and just tying back to what you said, I like the idea of like they work for us, like I feel like we lose sight of that in a way,
Yes.
We definitely think that they just like, supreme leaders, they can't It's not our say, but it is at the end of the day. So I'm glad that your book is touching upon, like in the long haul, those kinds of thoughts for sure. And kind of to branch off of that, I'm hoping this can kind of transition into our authority building segment of the podcast because, well, we love to speak to people in positions like yours about how you can build authority and credibility. So, I mean, we've mentioned before, you're a physician, an engineer, published historian, author, right? So I'm wondering, how do people react when they hear that combination of titles? I mean, would you think that the combination of all these credentials work for you or against you, or?
Oh, definitely. For me, even historians, when I find errors, and I do find errors in their books sometimes, they will write back to me. I don't think they would write back to me if I wasn't a physician. I think that there's a certain surprise that a physician is writing a letter to correct them. So it definitely gives me authority. I, you know, have run into roadblocks of people who don't want to listen. It is very well ingrained. I mean, you're young, your audience is young, and they may not realize how ingrained this legacy of Lindbergh as an anti-Semite and a racist is among people of my generation and older. Sometimes you just can't overcome it. Sometimes you just cannot get people to. I mean, if I'd written a book about somebody in history who was truly evil, all right, I understand why people don't want to read about it. I mean, you don't want to read a book saying, George Wallace he was a governor from Alabama in the 1960s. He was a segregationist. You don't want to read a book saying George Wallace was a good guy. You don't want to. He was a segregationist. There's no, a person who writes a book like that should be ignored. But I don't think Lindbergh is in that category. And if after you read my book you think he is, email me, convenientvillain@gmail.com, or email me before you read the book. That's fine. I'm happy to hear from readers and listeners and people who disagree with me, and I get quite a few hostile questions when I'm on the road. And, but that's okay. I mean, I'm just trying to generate a conversation about this man. It's been 80 years. I don't really think there's anybody out there who should take it personally anymore.
Understood, right. So like we said about, reach out to me, talk to me about it, kind of keeping that door open, which I think any leader or authority figure should really have. I mean, kind of ties right back into what was that phrase? Putting their feet in the fire, right? Having that open door policy,
Holding their feet to the fire.
holding their feet to the fire. Having that open door policy though really just allows you to have that credibility and transparency that people need from their leaders. So, I mean, would you agree that that's kind of, I feel like that's part of what you're doing here is having open communication with people too. Would you say that adds a big?
One of the things I'm trying to do is just teach people about a remarkable period in American history. I was not alive during World War II either. My parents were children during World War II. But it's an absolutely fascinating series of events from the end of World War I to the Depression to World War II. Young people they know what World War II was. They know we fought the Germans and the Japanese. They know we won. But the buildup to it and the resistance of the American people to enter the war and how we were convinced to enter the war and how events overseas changed people's opinions in an era when the news was heavily censored, in an era when people didn't have access to news very often. I mean, I spent a lot of time talking to my uncles who were in their 90s and explaining to me that the only time they got news was on the weekends when they went to the movies. Since there was no audio-visual news, there was no television. The only time they ever saw pictures of what was going on in the world is before the movies came on. There would be a 10-minute or 15-minute newsreel that would say, this is what's going on. That was all they knew about the world. And in that environment, how did people form an opinion first that we don't want to enter World War II, and then we're willing to enter World War II? We're willing to die. We're willing to see our children die. We're willing to see our siblings die for something that was not immediately affecting us. And that's a story that transcends all generations because we're always being asked to sacrifice in the name of right. Okay, this is right, and we're going to go sacrifice financially. We're going to go sacrifice with blood for what is right. And it's an aspirational objective. We can't always do that. The United States can't always do what's right. We don't have enough money. We don't have enough people. We simply can't, but we can always try.
Right.
And Lindbergh was on the wrong side of that argument. Lindbergh was the one saying we shouldn't. And why he said that and why he was wrong is very, even if you dislike him, it's interesting to learn about.
Exactly. Yeah. And I do like what you said about like how they only got their news once a week. Because I mean, nowadays I wear a watch and it buzzes whenever there's a new news alert, like throughout the day, and I get like 10 of them, you know. So imagine going like a week without hearing news. I mean, it's
So when I was a boy, I watched the news with my dad every night, and Vietnam was going on.
Mm.
And I saw dead soldiers. I saw wounded American soldiers. I had an idea what Vietnam was. My parents and my grandparents had no idea. They never saw blood. They never saw wounded soldiers. When I give slide presentations, I show pictures that they were shown of Normandy Beach, and we've all seen Saving Private Ryan. We all know how bad it was. You know, the equipment is all stacked up nicely. The people are obviously actors. They look very, very healthy. They really had no idea what was going on. And there was a lot of post-traumatic stress disorder when the soldiers came home because nobody really understood what they'd been through and nobody wanted to talk about it. Lindbergh predicted a lot of that. He talked a lot about what the war was going to cost, and nobody else wanted to talk about it. Roosevelt in particular had no interest in talking about it. Now we know. I mean, now your age group knows what happens if they go to war. They know what they'll be up against. They know what they'll face. We see news of it. Then they didn't.
Yeah, yeah, it's very interesting to think about the difference between transparency versus being well knowledgeable about it. And I guess that's again just relating back to your book too, like opening up the doors and showing the facts to what's really going on. So now that you have this book out there, I'm curious to know like what's next for you. You've worked on this for years. It's out there in the future. I do understand you were invited to, is it speak at the 100th anniversary? So that's really exciting.
Yes, yes.
Tell us a little bit about that and what other projects you have on the
So
radar.
I mean, I have a job. I have a career. I'm a cardiologist. This is a hobby,
Okay.
and I have no intention of writing another book. My intention is simply to travel around the country talking about Charles Lindbergh. I'd like to get a bigger publisher. I would like to get a public relations firm. There's a lot of things I'd like to do to get more publicity. The 100th anniversary is a big deal because you're going to read a lot about him, and I want to be the guy with the story. There's plenty of people out there that'll talk about what a bad person he was. I want to give a balanced picture of it. He wasn't evil. See, the thing about evil people is that it's very easy to find a quote or some event in their lives that shows that they were evil. With Lindbergh, it's very hard because he really didn't say anything. There's a lot of nuance. There's a lot of, well, in 1941, that meant this, not that. And you don't have to do that for evil people. For evil people, there's no nuance. They just come out and they say what they want to do, and it doesn't have to be interpreted. They pull a lot of stuff out of his journal. He kept a very, people don't do this anymore, but he kept a very in-depth journal. It's 1,000 pages long. And in 1,000 pages, you can find quotes that are not good. And if you only take the bad quotes and you ignore all the good quotes, you can make somebody look very bad. But I don't think that's right. I don't think that's fair because you could do that to anybody. Harry Truman kept a journal. You can pull stuff out of his journal that's absolutely awful. That's much, much worse than anything you could pull out of Charles Lindbergh's journal. But Truman was a great president. I don't think that that's how you establish a man's legacy, by taking one sentence out of 1,000 pages of their thoughts.
Right, exactly. And so that's why I kind of need to find the big version of it, the whole truth. And very noble that you're able to kind of go out there and speak on it. So hopefully everyone listening today is inspired by what you're saying and are inspired to connect with you on social, figure out those next states you're going to be speaking, check out the books themselves, all that. So where's the best place for people to connect with you? Do you have a certain site that they can head
Well,
to?
I have a website at convenientvillain.com. They can email me at convenientvillain@gmail.com. I'm on Amazon, barnesandnoble.com, if you want to buy the book. But I'm really much more interested in what you think than selling the book. I really am interested in hearing what people think, and trying to get myself in a position so that when the 100th anniversary approaches, people are coming to me to ask me to give my side of the story. There have been plenty of people that have wanted to write this book. Members of his family, his children have wanted to write this book. They really can't, because they'll be called an anti-Semite. I cannot credibly be called an anti-Semite, not just because I'm Jewish, but I speak Hebrew. There's an award here behind me from the Israeli government, right there over my shoulder, for fighting anti-Semitism. So I have a certain level of credibility, and the fact that I have no attachment to him, I'm not related to him, I have no attachment to his family. There's no reason for me to be doing this other than it's what I want to do. So, to all the people who see this podcast, if you're interested in history, if you're interested in World War II history, I meet young people who've never heard of him. I mean, he may have been the most famous man of the 20th century who was never elected to a political office. And, I find that a little upsetting, but it's understandable. To you, it's ancient history. But there's a lot to be learned. It's a very interesting story. I mean, his son was kidnapped and murdered. He went from being a hero to being pitied, to being a villain, with an 11th grade education. I mean, it's just a fascinating story.
Absolutely. Yeah. And guys, if you're curious and want to learn more, well, John has laid it all out for us. It's been a pleasure. And not only that, but he's really demonstrated what it means to take a passion, take a book, and turn that into leverage for his own authority to spread the message of something that's important. You have an amazing message, something that everybody needs to know about, like this. But if you don't establish yourself as somebody that has the authority to speak on it, and it shows they're knowledgeable about it, well, you're falling flat. And clearly you've done this, Jonathan. You've done the work. You've dabbled in everything enough to show, hey, I'm the man for this. You guys need to listen to me and and shape the way you think. So I love that. And thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us.
Thank you, everybody. I look forward to hearing from you.
Of course, yeah. So guys, all of John's contact info is in the description box of this podcast today. Get connected, reach out to him. He wants to chat with you, wants to hear your opinion. So go ahead and do that. And yeah, it's been a really fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right, everybody. And until next time, just remember to keep demanding your own authority. We'll see you next time on the Authority on Demand podcast.
That's a wrap on another episode of the Authority on Demand podcast. If today's conversation sparked something in you, don't keep it to yourself. Share this episode with a founder or a leader who's ready to stop being the best kept secret in their industry. If you want to turn your expertise into inbound demand, head to authorityondemand.com to see how we help clients go from unknown to in demand. I'm Danielle Hutchinson, and I'll catch you on the next one. Now, go build some authority.